Greetings and salutations, everyone. Garrosh, Mother Truck, and Hellscream. Probably one of the most complicated but interesting characters in all of Warcraft. It's really no surprise that he has such a wide fan base that he does. He's the son of Garrosh Hellscream, a son of a fabled hero of the Horde who freed the orcs from the demons. Garrosh isn't afraid to get his hands dirty to achieve victory. Hell, even I like the guy. You know me, I love orcs, and he single-handedly did put the war in Warcraft when he reigned as the Warchief of the Horde. He was a truly phenomenal character and a well-fleshed-out villain. But with that, many would say his term as villain came from nowhere, when his arc came to a close in Mist of Pandaria and Warlords of Draenor. Which, yeah, that's not exactly true, but let's take a swing at proving why that is, why that isn't true. I can already tell I might regret making this video already, but here goes anyways. Today, I'm going to prove to you why Garrosh Hellscream's downfall was not out of nowhere. Now, obviously for my own ease, I am not going to cover every single aspect and story of Garrosh's character. That would be hours upon hours, and nobody has the time for that. Really, the only parts that truly matter to demonstrate just how he got from here to here. While not much of Garrosh's villainous tendencies are found in his humble beginnings in Garradar, I still think it's rather important to show just how far Garrosh did change, and how that can leave some major confusion. Garrosh went from a depressed, whiny young leader doing very little to fend off the ogres harassing his people, into one of the most headstrong, warmongering orcs on the face of Azeroth, who took every opportunity to wage war with the Alliance when he could. And it all came from the tales of how his father freed the orcish people from Manoroth. Thrall would tell Garrosh on just how this worked out and how this entailed. This tale alone inspired Garrosh into becoming the orc that we know him today. The tale of how Garrosh single-handedly sacrificed himself to free the orcish people by killing Manoroth changed Garrosh from hating and being depressed over the actions of his father, of damning his people, instead into wishing he was more like his father, wanting to be a hero for all orcs everywhere to admire and respect. It should be noted that while Garrosh Hellscream was a hero to the orcish people, his actions weren't exactly the best either, and Thrall simply saw a lot of the good in Grom, the good in whom he viewed not only as a hero to be sung for ages to come, but in someone he deemed his brother. Thrall really only got a taste of the worst of Grom, and didn't point out his flaws as much as he should have to Garrosh. Although, to be frank, I don't think it would have done much anyways. Anyways, Thrall would take Garrosh back home to Azeroth with him to join the ranks in the Horde. This is where we got more of an understanding of who exactly the type of person Garrosh is, and would stick with his characterization until the day he died, and then, well, died again. He was far more arrogant, headstrong, and active. Garrosh was far more ready to take charge in situations. His hatred for the Alliance also started to be shown more around this time, which honestly wasn't as noticeable before when on Outland, but at the same time, that was when he was in his more depressed stage. When the Lich King awoke from his slumber and attacked Orgrimmar, Garrosh had challenged Thrall to a Mak'gora to decide who should lead the charge against the Lich King. One could attribute this to just how orcs usually decide leaders, but it's one of the first few things Garrosh does to someone who brought hope back into his life, and shows a manner of really just disrespect in regards to not only Thrall's leadership, but also just Thrall as a whole. Now, ultimately, the Mak'gora is interrupted because of the intensity of the Scourge attack on Orgrimmar, and Thrall ends the battle quickly to handle this situation, ultimately leaving Varrock SAURFANG and Garrosh in charge of the assault in Borean Tundra in Northrend. Again, we get a taste for how Garrosh acts in the role of leader, and rather than wanting to work together with the Alliance within the assault in Boring Tundra, he often shows time and time again he'd rather take them out and deal with the Scourge alone. He gets a lot of lessons from the old orc and his mentor, SAURFANG, but it's not really followed by much, and we'll come up later at how much he actually followed it for the most part. SAURFANG even warns that if Garrosh continued down this path of bloodlust for warfare, or if he took the Horde down a dark path, he would end him himself. Yet another pattern we'll soon see with many other characters. As the war progressed further in Northrend, a dark secret was uncovered by Bran Bronzebeard. The old god Yogg-Saron had stirred from his prison, and it would need the Horde and Alliance to band together to put a stop to it. Thrall brought Garrosh along to witness these talks, and Garrosh doubted the truth in the dwarf's words, and especially doubted an alliance with the Alliance. Despite Jaina's warnings, Garrosh marched up to the Violet Citadel and would rush out at the sight of King Varian, and the two would fight despite Thrall asking him to control himself. It was the leader of the Kirin Tor who would put a stop to the fight, and ultimately left Thrall disappointed in Garrosh. Garrosh believed that a true Warchief would never partner with the cowardly Alliance, and would leave. While it was true that there was a lot of bad blood between the Horde and the Alliance after the events of the Wrathgate, this showed that Garrosh really wasn't willing to work together with the opposite faction, despite time and time again it proving to save all of Azeroth. Much later, Thrall and Garrosh were invited by Tyrion Fordring to witness the Union and the games at the Argent Tournament grounds. Garrosh remained ever so disrespectful and believed nothing would come from these games, much to Thrall's increasing disappointment. During this tournament, to prove who was worthy to help face off against the Lich King, an Eredar demon was summoned by a member of the Alliance, Wilfred Fizzlebang, Master Summoner, which had Garrosh erupt into demanding that the Alliance answer for this treachery. Depending on which side you are on, Garrosh will have his Horde champions face off against you, and ultimately lose their lives because Garrosh felt he was disrespected by the words of King Varian and the rest of the Alliance. With the war with the Lich King concluded, SAURFANG would remain behind to mourn the loss of his boy, Dranosh, who died at the Wrathgate, while Cairn Bloodhoof would personally see to it that Garrosh would be brought back to Orgrimmar safely. During this voyage in the Horde's own waters, they encountered an Alliance envoy, which Garrosh would attack against Cairn's wishes. While the Alliance crew were spared, this was during a peace treaty between both the factions, and this would surely come to bite the Horde later. Now that we've covered most of Garrosh's atrocious behavior towards the Alliance around the start of his career with the Horde, we can at last speak more on his behavior both as Warchief and his view on the other races within the Horde. Thrall, as you know, had to place someone in charge of the Horde while he was away, and believed that Garrosh was the best choice considering his alternatives just were too old or were dead. Despite many others, including Garrosh, thinking he really just wasn't ready for this type of task, this type of leadership. Cairn didn't believe in this especially, and ultimately Garrosh chose instead to take the advice of Magatha Grimtotem much later, who played into his wants and his desires, eventually costing Cairn his life and ultimately dishonoring Garrosh when the two engaged in a mock Garra, as Magatha had poisoned Gorehowl to ensure Garrosh would win in their matchup, thus showing the type of people Garrosh was willing to trust and how far he was willing to go. Magatha would not be the first nor the last person that Garrosh would put his faith in when he really shouldn't have. This created a rift between the Tauren and the Horde, but was ultimately resolved by Bane for the most part. While the Tauren remained loyal, it was pretty clear that Bane and most of his people didn't agree with Garrosh's ideals, and they would also remember how he killed Karen Bloodhoof. This wouldn't be the last time that Garrosh would create animosity between him and another race of the Horde, though. As for the Trolls, or the Darkspears, Garrosh showed a great deal of disrespect to them. An argument would erupt between Vol'jin and Garrosh, resulting in the Darkspears being moved to the slums, and Vol'jin being exiled from the capital. Vol'jin nearly left the Horde, but was stirred to remain by Thrall, once more showing the disdain Garrosh had for one of the most venerable races within the Horde, and disregarded another one of the advisors that Thrall had left him. At least this time he didn't kill him. Oh, that's gonna come up. The Forsaken were no different and were treated as nothing more than meat shields in Garrosh's campaign against the Gilneans. And while yes, the Forsaken were responsible for the travesty of the Wrathgate, and trust between them and the Horde was on a decline, Garrosh proved yet again to be dismissal of the Forsaken and their future. Whether they should even have a future is up to the beholder, but it's still important to point out just how many times Garrosh dismissed the other members and leaders of the Horde. He was very disrespectful towards a lot of its members and leaders. So yeah, Garrosh for a long while paved the way to make the entire Horde's races hate his guts, through one way or another. Outside of the Orcs, which Garrosh gave every reason for them to appreciate him in some capacity, he brought war and conquest back, while also fighting to gain better resources and land outside of the desolate landscape of Durotar. Yes, there were times where Garrosh had moments where he showed he was a good leader and capable of greatness, but those moments were short-lived, and those specified moments were namely catered to one race, the Orcs. As Warchief, Garrosh needed to show his level of care beyond just his own people, as that is what the leader of the entire Horde needed to do. One of those moments was with Cromgar, a Horde general who took things particularly too far by blowing up a tree filled with innocent druids. For his crimes, Garrosh personally executed him on the spot by dropping him from a cliff, thus delivering justice for the fallen and ridding the Horde of an honorless militant leader. It's one of the few defining moments of Garrosh showing growth. Plus, he even remembered the words bestowed on him from Varrock, his old mentor.
Honor, Cromgar. No matter how dire the battle, never forsake it.
Unfortunately, the good outweighs the bad with Garrosh. Despite the needless destruction Deathwing brought around the globe, Garrosh would continue to fuel the war effort in his dream for Azeroth to be ruled by the Horde. His Horde. So we've discussed how much Garrosh was already pretty proactive against the Alliance in almost every turn, and how much of a bigot he was to the other races inside of the Horde. I don't think Garrosh's turn wasn't too many steps away from how he already was. Following everything after the events of the Cataclysm, Garrosh would turn things up a notch in the war effort following against the Alliance by effectively dropping a mana bomb on the city of Theramore. His reasoning, it being a military target, wiping it off the map, and making the war span even further across the globe of Azeroth. Many would try to use this event of Stone Talon as a reasoning for this not making sense. Why is he disproving the bombing when he, is doing even something worse here to an even larger city? But those who died in Theramore were all those within the military. It was a strategy. Garrosh wanted all military, soldiers, generals, all that to be there when he took out the target. This, in Garrosh's own point of view, would be more honorable. This isn't to excuse Garrosh's actions, not by a long shot, but it explains both his behavior and his reasonings for doing so. Garrosh has been a warmonger for a long while now, as we have explained. Garrosh hated the Alliance and wanted them gone. The main thing that changed here, I think, was in regard to how he would do so. He would use the elements bent to his will, wild beasts, and, yes, explosive weapons that would devastate continents. Essentially anything to achieve his goals. One thing that would never change about Hellscream is his hatred for the Fel, and its use in battle or anything, which would carry with him until the end of his days. Heck, he would even bring such contempt for it in an ultimate reality. So, the one thing that Garrosh would never ever use in any capacity would be the Fel. That is the one thing he was always against. With Garrosh's lust for war going further and further, and his own alienation of the other races in the place of his elevation for his own people, the Orcs, it was only a matter of time that they would turn their backs on him. Again, as we discussed, Garrosh was already mistreating the other races in his plans for conquest. This would go most of all to the Darkspears, as he wouldn't take them on his expedition to Pandaria. Despite this, Vol'jin would still try to play along with Garrosh until his plans to use the relics from the Mogu for his own means, which of course resulted in the assassination attempt on Vol'jin when he refused to allow Garrosh to use their methods with the Hordes. The mistreatment by Garrosh wouldn't stop with the Darkspears or with Vol'jin, as he would continue to mistreat the other races in the Blood Elves, Goblins, and even the Pandaren throughout the Pandaria campaign, namely by using the Sindori as a means to an end and not caring what fate awaits them after he got what he wanted. This happened specifically with the Divine Bell and resulted in the purging of Dalron, which almost had the Sindori completely leave the Horde from these events, but they were driven back because of what Jaina essentially did to them. He underpaid the goblins that he hired for their work, even if they died in service to him. And lastly, by trying to butcher and torment the very leader of the Hwaujinji Firepaw, who nearly died from his mistreatment by the Korkron. This of course would result in the rebellion against Hellscream, led by a rather still alive Vol'jin, joined by the many other disgruntled and alienated races of the Horde, who in Garrosh's own words were no longer a part of his Horde. Like I said, not really much of a stretch for old Garry, as he had a serious trust issue with the other races, and really only saw the Orcs as the one true race of the Horde. The rest were just expendable. And once he lost his true Horde to the Rebellion, as well as his title of Warchief, he turned to the next best thing and created a secondary Horde under a new banner, the Iron Horde, with his dear old dad and an entire band made of only the race Garrosh truly ever valued. All of this would culminate in Garrosh that we know and love today. His love for warfare and his intolerance for the other races in the Horde would ultimately lead to his own demise and his own fall into villainhood. Struck down by the very person who placed him in the position of power and believed in him most. A truly tragic and fitting end for a beloved character. At least to me, that is. So no, Garrosh's apparent out-of-nowhere behavior against the other races, the Alliance, everything really just falls into place with the guy. I think that while Garrosh is a fascinating individual and an extremely awesome villain and character, I think that there were just plenty of hints regarding the type of person and character he was, and where he would likely end up. I think that it was pretty obvious in where he was going to go for a while, if he was going to continue to go down this route. I think one of the only things that I kind of felt out of place was his use of the Old Gods and the Shah, but I suppose you could line that up with him wanting to follow in the Mogu's footsteps, or even surpass them by harnessing a power that no other could bend to their will. As Garrosh did often look to the Mogu and their empire, it would often compare their ruthless conquest to his own. Garrosh was able to somehow master the heart of Y'Shaarj and not succumb to its whispers, so there is that at least. But I won't deny it feels a bit weird for him to turn away one dark power and thumb up the next. Outside of that though, everything else is pretty in line with Garrosh. Now of course there was always the chance he could have turned in any direction beyond just this one, but I think it's very disingenuous to not point out what he was already acting like in this expansion and what happened prior. I also think it's important to remember you can still like a character when they're flawed, villainous, or embody really crappy behavior. It's fiction. As long as you stick to it just being fiction and not take these sorts of ideas in the real world, you'll be fine. It's weird that even needs to be said, but that's the world we live in, I guess. I don't know. This isn't some hit piece to you Garrosh fans out there, it's just something I was noticing to be a trend, and much like the Thrall cheated line, I had to make a video on it to clarify that no, Garrosh definitely was exhibiting these traits even before Mr. Pandaria. Believe me, Garrosh is still one of my favorite villains, and it's his fall from grace that makes me like him even more, but hey, that's me. But what do you all think? Do you think Garrosh's downfall into villainy was out of nowhere or not? I'd certainly like to know down below. If you guys like this video, feel free to drop a like or subscribe. You can also check out my other social medias in the description. You can also join me on my Discord where we talk about all sorts of things. And if you like me enough, you can support me on my Patreon like these amazing folks here. It helps me a ton to provide you with these sorts of videos. But until next time, my friends,